Hello. You'll have to excuse my voice is not perfect because I'm getting over a cold. So hopefully you can still understand me. I think it should be fine. So the subject of what I want to talk about today, it's a big one. There's a lot that goes into this one, and of course I'm speaking only from my own perspective, right? Because that's the only perspective that I have. And I think it's on this topic specifically, because it is so broad, I think disagreement is normal and natural. So if you're listening and you find that you disagree at points, or even if you disagree fundamentally, I welcome that, because I think this one deserves conversation. This is something that we should be having conversations about, I think. So, that said, if you want to leave a comment, please do, because I'm genuinely interested in other people's opinions. I want to hear what you think and what your experience is. So I'll start by reading like a short part of this paragraph. It comes from an essay by Nishitani Keiji called Science and Zen, and it's from the book The Buddha Eye, which is a sort of anthology of essays by Japanese Zen Buddhists. And so in this essay, Keiji's talking about sort of the scientific nihilism and the interplay of spirituality and scientism, and this sentence is really interesting, and it's also a lot. It's hard to understand, so after I read it, I will go through it again. It took me a few times to understand it too, because the whole essay is like that. It's hard to understand. But anyway, he says, "For a thinker who faces science existentially, i.e., who accepts it as a problem for his own existence as such, that the usual state of the universe is explained by science in terms of lifeless materiality, means that the universe is a field of existential death for himself and for all mankind." Okay, so it's quite a sentence. Essentially what he's saying, I think, is that science kind of expresses its worldview of what life is and of what the essence of existence is, by saying that it is a lifeless materiality. So meaning that you can sort of reduce life down to like particles and atoms and these very like basic mechanical sort of building blocks that themselves don't have like a soul, right? So all of existence, all of life, human beings, we can be reduced to this lifeless materiality underneath it all. And because of that, there's an existential death that takes place, right? If we reduce ourselves down to just our most basic, chemical components or whatever, then in doing so, we lose sort of the concept of soul, or we lose this kind of indefinable mystical quality that is not observable in science, but which as human beings we experience, right? And I think that's the really interesting the interesting aspect of this argument, I suppose. He's not saying that science and because he is talking about religion, through the lens of Zen, but he's not saying that religion and science aren't compatible. He's talking specifically about sort of the fundamental existential nihilism that is often present in sort of the scientific worldview. And I think that's a decent way of sort of summarizing the argument. So that builds into the broader topic that I want to talk about, which is sort of spirituality generally. The fact that for many people, I think especially like people of a certain demographic or a certain background, spirituality is not very present in their lives. And for some people, that's no problem, right? Some people are very happy being atheists, describing themselves as atheists, and taking that sort of very materialistic, scientific worldview. Some people have no problem. But that said, I think that simultaneously there is a desire for spirituality. There's a desire for like a higher meaning to existence. Because if you take that really hard line scientific approach of like, there's no meaning behind anything, it's just the blind watchmaker, right? In the words of Richard Dawkins, I think, was the one who said that, right? Like evolution and the chemical reactions that happen in the universe are random, essentially. They just happen. There's no meaning behind them. There's no purpose behind them. If you're a certain type of person and you think about that too hard, it's very scary, right? Because, and that's when sort of, I think, at least for me, this has been my experience, when you think like that, you start to feel this sort of existential dread creeping in of like, well, if there's no meaning, if there's no purpose behind anything, if death is just a complete and ultimate annihilation of self, of experience, then what is the point, right? Let's see if I can find my quotation. I wrote something about this. Of course, I dropped everything. It's tough when you're getting over a cold and you're trying to talk about philosophy. All right. So recently, here it is. I had read Tolstoy. I started by reading. So he's the famous Russian novelist from the 19th century. I think late 1800s he was writing. And Tolstoy grew up sort of a wealthy, educated. I don't know if he was exactly an urbanite, but he was a man of like high society. He was a wealthy. He came into wealth essentially as a young man, and he was very much exposed to that, like the scientific nihilism of his age, because this was post-Enlightenment. This was sort of the beginning of the like capitalist, it was on the heels of the Industrial Revolution, and capitalism was really starting to go off, and colonialism, and this was sort of replacing the divine right of kings, right? Because we saw like the French Revolution, we saw the end of monarchies, of long-established monarchies. Anyway, it was very much a period of liberalism, really, coming to be in, like, especially in urban centers like Moscow and St. Petersburg and Paris and London, where people were turning away from religion, monarchic sort of worldviews into this very scientifically oriented worldview. So Tolstoy was an atheist or a non-believer for most of his life, or a large chunk of his life. And he described the sort of existential dread that it gave him. He was like, this sucks. He was like, I hate this because if God doesn't exist, if God is dead, what is there to live for? What is the point of anything? And what happened is so he was a landowner, he was wealthy, and he was observing the peasants, right, who were working for him, and he was, working with them and to some extent, like, living among them to some extent. Of course, he was still separate as a landowner, but he observed that, these peasants who we have been trained to look down upon as the wealthy, sort of liberal, urban elite, whatever, they're happier than we are. Or at least that was his assumption based on what he was observing. He was like, they don't seem to have this sort of existential dread that we do. And he was like, what's going on here? How can that be? Because they're poor and they're living in, relative squalor, and by all means they should be miserable, right? But he was like, they're not. What is different about that? And what he came to realize, or what he sort of, his theory, I suppose, was that it was because they retained they had retained their spirituality. They had retained their, not only that, their their connection to the land and their community. And that was part of what drove him into his own quest for religion and his own quest for God. And in the course of doing that, in the course of his search for faith, he did actually study Buddhism for a while. He rejected it ultimately and decided to become a Christian, but he did study it, which I think is really interesting. That someone 200 years ago kind of had access to the same things that we have access to now in terms of information, religion, different spiritualities, different worldviews. Anyway, it's very interesting. So one of the things that he said, and this is from his book Confession, where he talks about his life and his break from atheism and his move into faith, is he says, the essence of any faith lies in giving life a meaning that cannot be destroyed by death. So that's what he says in Confession about faith, right? And he also says, I had come to faith because apart from it I could find nothing but ruin. Nothing but ruin. So, in typical Tolstoy fashion, it's quite dramatic, right? He was a very dramatic, neurotic guy. The end of his life, he ran away from his wife and tried to join a monastery, only to unfortunately pass away along the way. But yeah, he was a very neurotic guy, but also a very sensitive person, and essentially what he says in Confession, and it's obvious when you're reading his works as well, more broadly, he rejected the sort of the underlying nihilism of science because it felt empty, because it felt hopeless, because there was nothing there to give him like a purpose, like a desire to keep living. And he even says in Confession, he's like, why not just, stop living then? Why not just decide to stop living? If the world is just this lifeless, purposeless void, right, where the ultimate outcome of everything is death. So, he became a Christian, while also vocally rejecting the church, which got him into some trouble. But he became a Christian on his own terms, very much. And it gave him a lot of comfort. I think it's fair to say that it did. So, you wonder then, why is there this, not necessarily universal, but almost, I think, desire as human beings to seek purpose in not necessarily religion, but in spirituality, at least. Why? And I think one of the answers that you can give to that is like, well, because the sort of pure scientific nihilism is scary. It's scary. And that's not to say that science isn't this, incredibly powerful thing that has given us amazing technologies and, a higher standard of life, and we're living longer, and, all these wonderful things. It's a very powerful series of tools. But then you also ask yourself, or at least I ask myself, like, yes, we're living longer. Yes, our material quality of life is, for many of us, not all of us in the world, obviously, but for many of us, better. But the question, the underlying problem there is, for me, is, are we happier? Even with all this stuff, even with being able to live until we're 80, 90, 100 years old, are we actually happier? And if not, why not? And it's not just because of nihilism, but I think that's one way that it sort of expresses itself. So, I'll probably talk about this more later, because I find I can talk forever about this concept. I think it's so interesting. The idea of, why do we seek spirituality? Is this scientific realism worldview actually helping us or hurting us as emotional beings? Is there a way to, find a sort of spirituality that is fulfilling, but also progressive, and not necessarily tied in with like hierarchies and church and organized religion? Can we find that? And how do we find that? And this is one of the things that appeals to me very much about Buddhism, is that it is friendlier. It's friendlier than some other religions, and that's a generalization. It's not always true. But I think fundamentally it is. And here's another source. In this book, The Philosophy of Zen Buddhism, Byung-Chul talks specifically about friendliness. The last chapter of this book is literally called that. It's called Friendliness. And he talks about the sort of fundamental openness that is radiated through the experience of like enlightenment, or the experience of the Buddhist emptiness. And it's really interesting, and I wish I had understood more of that chapter, but this is one of the most difficult books that I've ever tried to read, so I think if I got 70% out of this book, I think that's a pretty good score. Yeah, so going back to the essential point, the essential question, it's like, is this liberal, nihilistic, scientific worldview good? It's a very broad question. Is it helping us? Is it hurting us? Is it maybe even like destroying something in terms of the way that we approach ourselves, our souls, our communities especially? And how do we reclaim spirituality? You know, how do we reclaim, but not just spirituality, but community, and, you know, our connection with each other, with the land, with our families, our ancestors, our descendants? You know, the sort of thing that Tolstoy saw when he was working with the peasants, like, you know, because, like, look, most of us, like, I hate to break it to you, I hate to break it to myself, but we are the peasants, you know, like, we are the working class, we are the underclass. Most of us do not have vast wealth, or much wealth, or any wealth, you know, we are the peasants, but we don't even have, like, spirituality to guide us, like many of us, right? So, just something to think about. It's a topic that I could talk about forever. So please let me know what you think. I would also love if you have any book recommendations, or, you know, even video recommendations, or talks that you've seen, or Dharma talks that you think are worth watching, or whatever. I'm always interested in hearing new viewpoints. So, I'm going to call it here because I'm still getting over this damn cold. But thank you. Thank you for watching. I wish all the best to you. See you later.